My name is Sylvia Jean Moreno, and I want to tell you about the night I almost closed my laptop for good and gave up on the whole embarrassing enterprise, and how I did not, and what happened because I did not. But first I need to tell you how I got to that night, which requires me to tell you about the marriage, and the divorce, and the 18 months I spent afterward convincing myself that I was fine when I was something considerably more complicated than fine. I was married to Frank Moreno for 31 years. We met in 1984 in Phoenix, Arizona, where I had moved after college to teach elementary school and where he was working as a structural engineer. He was tall and dark-haired and made very good enchiladas and had a laugh that came from somewhere deep and honest. And for many years those qualities, along with others, constituted a life I was genuinely glad to be living. We had 2 children, Rosa, born in 1988, and Miguel, born in 1991. We bought a house in Scottsdale and painted it terra cotta and planted a garden that never quite flourished in the desert heat, but that I tended anyway because tending things is something I have always needed to do. I will not give you the full anatomy of the marriage's decline because it is not entirely mine to give, and also because the decline itself is less important to this story than what came after it. What I will say is that by 2010, we were 2 people living in the same house who had, over the years, become very good at the logistics of a shared life and quite poor at the interior of one. We were not unkind to each other. We were not dramatic. We were something harder to name and in some ways harder to recover from. We had become strangers who knew each other's habits perfectly and had stopped asking about anything beneath the habits a long time ago. We separated in 2014 and divorced in 2015. I was 50 years old. The divorce was not acrimonious and was not simple and involved the kind of practical rearrangements that the end of a 30-year shared life always involves. The house, the accounts, the furniture, the years. I moved into an apartment in Tempe, near the school where I had been teaching for 20 years by then, and I told myself that 50 was not old and that this was, if I chose to see it that way, a beginning rather than an ending. I chose to see it that way most of the time. The other times I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and the specific quiet of a person who has been surrounded by family for 30 years and is now suddenly not, and I felt the quiet in my body like a physical condition. It was not unbearable. But it was present, and it did not go away quickly. And anyone who tells you that being alone after a long marriage is primarily liberating in the early months is either lying or has a different nervous system than I do. The 18 months after the divorce, I spent rebuilding the infrastructure of a life that did not depend on another person. I was good at this in the practical ways. I learned to manage the apartment, the finances, the car, the medical appointments, all the things that Frank and I had divided between us and that were now entirely mine. I became, in the language of self-help books I occasionally read and mostly mistrusted, self-sufficient. What I was less good at was the social dimension of being a single person at 50, which is different from being a single person at 25 in ways that are both obvious and hard to articulate. The infrastructure of couplehood runs deep in the social world of people in their 50s. The dinner parties configured for even numbers, the events that assume a partner, the well-meaning friends who look at you with a slight corrective tilt of the head, as if you are a picture that has come slightly off the wall and needs adjusting. I was not interested in adjusting. I was interested in building something new. I was just not entirely sure what that looked like or whether at 50, then 51, then 52, it included another person. Rosa suggested online dating in 2018. She was 30 years old and had met her husband on a dating app, and was therefore an enthusiast of the form in the specific way of people who have succeeded at something and believe their success is generalizable. She sat across from me at a restaurant in Phoenix over a glass of wine and said, "Mom, you have been alone for 3 years. You are not a person who is supposed to be alone. I'm going to set up a profile for you." I said, "Absolutely not," she said. "I'm going to do it anyway." I said, "Rosa," she said, "Mom." This is, more or less, the conversation we have been having her entire life, with the positions occasionally reversed. I did not let Rosa set up the profile. What I did, 6 months later, in a moment of what I can only describe as mild pandemic-adjacent courage, was set one up myself. It was 2019. I was 55, and I chose one of the apps that was marketed specifically toward people over 40, which I found both reassuring and slightly depressing in the way that things designed specifically for middle-aged people often are, as if the marketing alone is an acknowledgement that you have moved into a different category of existence. The profile took me 3 hours. The photograph was the most difficult part. I had, over the years of my marriage and then the years immediately after, stopped thinking very carefully about how I looked in photographs, which is to say I had stopped looking at myself as someone who might be looked at by a stranger with interest. Picking a photograph for a dating profile requires you to look at yourself this way, which is a peculiar and somewhat uncomfortable exercise at 55. I chose two. One taken at Rosa's wedding the previous year, in which I was wearing a blue dress and laughing at something Miguel had said, and one taken on a hiking trip with my friend Carmen in Sedona, in which I looked like someone who is capable of physical activity and outdoor adventure, which is true, and which I felt was relevant information. The first 6 months of online dating produced the following: 14 matches, 9 conversations that did not progress past an initial exchange, 3 conversations that progressed to a first date, and 3 first dates that were, in their various ways, illuminating about the landscape of middle-aged dating in the American Southwest, without producing anything I would describe as promising. The first date was with a man named Gary who was 58 and very tall and talked for 45 minutes about his ex-wife in a way that made it clear he was not, whatever the app algorithm had determined, ready to be on a date with anyone. I listened with what I hope was genuine compassion and what I know included a fair amount of wine. Gary was not a bad person. He was a person who needed more time. I did not see him again. The second date was with a man named Richard who was 62 and recently retired, and who had approached online dating with the systematic efficiency of someone who had recently completed a project management certification. He had a checklist. He did not show it to me directly, but it was present in the structure of his questions, which moved through topics with the brisk thoroughness of a hiring interview. I answered his questions honestly and found him interesting enough and felt, at the end of the evening, nothing in particular. He texted me the next day to say he had enjoyed meeting me. I texted back that I had as well. We did not make plans to see each other again, and I did not follow up and neither did he, which was, I thought, the right outcome for two people who had been politely interested in each other and nothing more. The third date was the most instructive because it went badly in a specific way that taught me something about what I was actually looking for. His name was Bob. He was 59 and divorced and had a boat, which he mentioned 3 times in our initial conversation, and which I interpreted as enthusiasm for sailing rather than a personality trait, which was a misreading. Bob was pleasant and gregarious and spent most of dinner talking about the boat and the places he had taken the boat and the places he planned to take the boat and what the boat had cost and what it was now worth. I am not uninterested in boats. I am, however, extremely uninterested in being a supporting character in someone else's story about themselves, which was the role the evening seemed to require of me. I thanked Bob for dinner and drove home and sat in my apartment and thought, what exactly am I doing? I deactivated my profile in November of 2019 and did not reactivate it until the following February, when a combination of a long gray winter and a conversation with Carmen, who had also recently divorced and who had recently met someone she liked through the same app, convinced me to try again. The pandemic arrived the following month and made the whole enterprise moot for a while, and I spent the lockdown teaching 5th grade on a laptop, which was difficult and occasionally absurd, and which left me so thoroughly worn out in the evenings that the question of whether to send messages to strangers on a dating app did not arise with any urgency. I reactivated the profile again in the fall of 2020. I was 56 now, then 57, then 58, and the world had changed in ways that had made me, like many people, newly aware of the specific texture of time and what it meant to spend it. The pandemic had stripped away a great deal of the noise and logistics and social performance of ordinary life and had left, for long stretches, just the essential questions. What matters? Who matters? What do I actually want? I had been asking these questions with varying degrees of seriousness since the divorce, but the pandemic gave them a particular sharpness that I found clarifying even as I found the overall situation devastating. What I wanted, I had decided by 2021, was specific. I wanted conversation. Real conversation, the kind that starts with something and goes somewhere unexpected, the kind where you find yourself saying things you did not know you were going to say. I wanted someone who was curious about the world and about me and who was interesting in their own right. I wanted someone who understood what it meant to have lived a full life before this moment and who did not require that life to be invisible or ashamed of itself. I wanted, in the simple and difficult language of what people want, someone to talk to. And I wanted to feel, when we talked, the specific feeling of being seen by someone who is genuinely looking. This is a more precise set of requirements than many people bring to a dating app, which is designed around photographs and first impressions and the efficient processing of options. I was not efficient. I was careful and slow, and had decided, after the Gary and Richard and Bob episodes, that I would rather have 2 or 3 real conversations than 20 performative ones. So I changed how I used the app. Instead of swiping through profiles quickly, I read them, all of them fully. When I matched with someone, I sent a specific message that responded to something in their profile rather than a generic greeting. I did not apologize in my messages, which I had noticed I was doing. Sorry to bother you. Hope this isn't too forward, and I stopped doing it. I was not bothering anyone. This was what the app was for. The results were modestly better. I had a genuinely interesting conversation with a retired teacher named James who lived in Tucson and who was funny and thoughtful, and with whom I spoke, over the phone, for 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon in March. We did not meet in person because he had a medical situation that required him to stay close to home, and the phone conversations, though pleasant, eventually tapered off without quite reaching anything. I had a first date with a man named Paul, who was 60 and a landscape architect. That was the best first date I had had since starting this whole enterprise. We talked about gardens and teaching, and the specific quality of light in the Arizona desert in late October, and I drove home feeling genuinely good. Paul texted the next day and suggested a second date, and I was pleased, and then the second date was less good than the first in a way I could not quite name, and we had a third date that confirmed something had gone slightly flat. And after the third date, neither of us followed up, and I moved on with mild disappointment that faded within a week. In January of 2022, I turned 64. Rosa and Miguel took me to dinner, and my sister called from California, and Carmen came over in the afternoon with a bottle of champagne, and we sat in my garden, which had improved significantly from the early days of the apartment because I had had 6 years to figure out what grew in the specific conditions of my specific patch of Arizona. And we drank champagne and talked, and I thought, I am 64 years old. My children are grown and doing well. I teach children I love and who teach me things in return. I have a garden that mostly flourishes. I have friends who bring champagne. I am, by any reasonable accounting, fortunate. And I was lonely. Both things were true. The fortune and the loneliness were not in contradiction and did not cancel each other out, and I had learned, in the 9 years since the marriage ended, not to require one to erase the other. I almost deleted the dating app in February. I had been on it, on and off, for 4 years, and the cumulative effect of 4 years of first dates and partial connections and conversations that started well and went nowhere was a specific kind of tiredness that was not depression exactly, but that had a similar gravity, pulling me toward the conclusion that this particular project was not going to produce what I was looking for, and that my time was better spent on things that did not make me feel, periodically, like a person who is failing at something that should be simple. Carmen talked me out of deleting it, not with a speech but with a question. She said, "What would you do instead?" I thought about it. I said, "I don't know," she said. "Then keep the app." It was not a sophisticated argument, but it was the right one. I kept the app. In March, I matched with a man named David Chen. His profile was not, on first reading, particularly distinctive. He was 67, recently retired after a career as a high school history teacher. He had 2 grown children who lived in different cities. He liked hiking and cooking and reading, which are the 3 hobbies listed on approximately 40% of dating profiles in the 55 and over demographic, and which I had therefore learned not to weight heavily. What I did notice, reading more carefully, was the last paragraph of his profile. It said, "I have been on this app for 2 years and have had approximately 15 first dates and 0 second ones that led anywhere, and I am starting to wonder if the problem is the app or me, or the fundamental difficulty of finding a specific kind of person at a later stage of life." If you have also been wondering this, and if you are looking for someone who will read what you actually write and respond to it rather than sending a generic opener, I would genuinely like to talk to you. I read that paragraph twice. It was honest. It was specific. It acknowledged the awkwardness of the situation without being self-deprecating to the point of self-defeat. It indicated that he had been paying attention and found that paying attention mattered. I sent him a message. I said, "I read your last paragraph 3 times, and I have been on this app for 4 years, and I understood every word of it. I am a 5th grade teacher in Tempe who gardens and cooks and reads, and who has had 17 first dates, and also 0 second ones that went anywhere real. I would like to talk to you if you would like to talk to me." He responded within an hour. He said, "I would very much like to talk to you. Can I ask what you're reading right now?" This was a good question. Not because asking what someone is reading is inherently a good conversational opener, but because it was specific, and it indicated that he had read my profile, which said I liked reading, and had asked me something that required a real answer. I told him I was reading a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt that I had been putting off for 2 years and had finally started and was finding unexpectedly absorbing. He said he had read it and asked what I thought of the chapter on her relationship with Lorna Hickok, which was not the chapter I had reached yet but which I had heard about, and we were off. We messaged back and forth for 3 days. The messages were long, which was unusual in my experience of the app, and they covered a range of subjects that had the particular quality of conversations that start somewhere and go somewhere else without a visible transition. Eleanor Roosevelt led to the history of women in American political life, led to the specific texture of teaching children in the 2020s compared to the 1990s, led to whether the things we teach children stay with them or disappear, led to the question of what stays with a person from their own childhood. David told me that the thing that had stayed with him was the smell of his grandmother's kitchen in San Francisco's Chinatown, cardamom and something else he had never identified. I told him that what had stayed with me was the feeling of lying in my grandmother's garden in Tucson in the summer, the dry heat and the smell of creosote after rain, and the specific quality of that feeling, which was something between safety and possibility, the feeling that the world was large and that I was in a good part of it. He said, "That is the most precise description of a childhood feeling I have ever read." I said, "I have been trying to find the words for it for 60 years. He said, "Can I call you?" I said yes. He called that evening, which was a Thursday in March at 8 o'clock. We talked for 3 hours. I know this because I looked at the phone when we finally said goodnight, and it was 11:17, and I had sat down to take the call at 8:14. 3 hours and 3 minutes. I had been on dates that lasted 2 hours and felt longer. This conversation had lasted 3 hours and felt like 30 minutes. What did we talk about? Everything. Nothing that would look significant on a list. His teaching career and mine, which overlapped in the specific ways of people who have spent their lives in classrooms and who have therefore developed similar muscles and similar scar tissue. His divorce 8 years ago, which had been harder than mine in some ways and easier in others. His children, whom he described with the warmth of someone who loves and sees them clearly at the same time, which is a combination that requires effort and that I recognized because I work at it with my own children. His cooking, which had become more serious after he retired, and which had moved from the practical cooking of a parent feeding a family to the exploratory cooking of someone with time and curiosity. My garden. His apartment in Mesa, which did not have a garden but which had a patio where he grew tomatoes in containers with a level of success that I found immediately charming. The books we had each read and what we thought of them. The places we had each been and wanted to go. At some point, somewhere around 10 in the evening, He said something that I have thought about many times since. We were talking about retirement, which he had done the year before and which I was planning to do in 2 years, and I said something about not being sure what I would do with myself without the structure of teaching. He said, "I think you already know what you will do. You'll garden and you'll read and you'll cook and you'll be curious about things and you'll find people to talk to." That's not a retirement plan, that's a life. I was quiet for a moment. He said, "Did I overstep?" I said, "No, I was just thinking that nobody has described me that accurately in a very long time." He said, "I've been reading your messages carefully." I said, "I noticed that." He said, "It seemed important." We agreed to meet the following Saturday at a coffee shop in Tempe that I had suggested because it was near my apartment and had good light and the kind of ambient noise that is neither too loud nor too quiet. I hung up at 11:17 and sat in my living room for a while without turning on anything, just sitting in the quiet that was no longer quite the same quiet it had been before the call. Rosa called me the next morning, as she often does on Friday mornings when she knows I have a free period. I told her I had spoken to someone for 3 hours the night before. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Mom!" Just that, "Mom," in the specific tone that contains approximately 45 different things, most of them warm. I said, "Don't make it a thing." She said, "I'm not making it a thing." She was absolutely making it a thing internally, and I was glad. The coffee date was on a Saturday morning in late March, one of those Arizona mornings that is the reason people move to Arizona. The sky a particular shade of blue that seems engineered for clarity, and the air still cool enough to sit outside comfortably. I arrived 5 minutes early and sat at a table on the patio and watched the door. David arrived 2 minutes later. He was tall, slightly taller than I had expected from his photographs, with gray hair and the specific quality of a person who is comfortable in their own skin in the way that some people reach in their 60s that they could not have had at 30. He saw me through the window before he came outside and raised his hand in a small wave and smiled, and I smiled back, and then he came out and sat down across from me and said, "You look exactly like your photographs." I said, "So do you." He said, "I wasn't sure you would." I said, "Why not?" He said, "People generally don't." I said, "I don't know how to be anything other than what I am." He said, "That is the best thing you could have said." We had coffee and then walked to a park nearby and walked for an hour, and then had lunch at a restaurant I liked and talked for 4 more hours. I drove home at 4 in the afternoon and sat in my garden among the things that had finally learned to grow in this particular patch of desert and thought, something has happened. Something is different. Not dramatically, not with fireworks or the movie feeling of certainty. Something quieter and more real. The specific recognition of a person who is paying the right kind of attention to you and whom you find, in turn, genuinely worth paying attention to. We had a second date the following weekend, and a third the weekend after that, and by the fourth date, which was a Sunday when he came to my apartment and I cooked, we had fallen into the easy rhythm of people who are no longer on their best behavior, because their best behavior and their ordinary behavior have begun to converge. He brought wine and looked at my bookshelves for 20 minutes before we ate, pulling books out and asking about them, which is the kind of thing that either annoys you terribly or pleases you greatly depending on who you are, and I am the second kind. I cooked the chicken mole that my grandmother had taught me and that I make when I want something to be good. He said it was the best thing he had eaten since retiring. I believed him. After dinner, we sat on the small patio, and it was a warm evening and the sky had gone dark and was doing the thing it does in Arizona in the spring, the stars coming out one at a time as if they are being introduced rather than simply appearing. He said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What made you stay on the app? 4 years is a long time to keep trying at something that keeps not working." I thought about it honestly. I said, "I think I was afraid of the alternative." He said, "Which was?" I said, "Deciding that this part of my life was just going to be quiet, not bad, just quiet." He said, "And now?" I looked at the stars coming out one by one. I said, "I think quiet is fine, and I think not quiet is also fine. I think I just needed to know the difference was still available to me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I almost deleted the app the week before I matched with you." I said, "Carmen almost talked me into deleting it too." He said, "What stopped you?" I said. She asked me what I would do instead, and I didn't have an answer. He said. For me, it was my daughter. She said, Dad, you're not a person who is supposed to stop trying. I said, smart daughter. He said, she has her moments. We have been together for 2 years now. I want to tell you what that looks like, because it does not look like the before of our lives reconstructed. It looks like something new built from the particular materials of who we each are at this stage, which are different materials than the ones available at 30 or 40, and that make a different kind of structure. We do not live together. We have talked about it and are not opposed to it, and are also not in a hurry, because neither of us has anything to prove, and both of us have learned enough about ourselves to know that the pace of a thing matters as much as the thing itself. We cook together on Sunday evenings, usually at my apartment because the garden is here, and because I have more kitchen equipment. He has learned my mole recipe, and I have learned his Shanghainese red braised pork, which his grandmother made, and which he spent 2 years reconstructing from memory after she died. We walk in the mornings when I am not teaching and on weekends. We read in the same room, separately and together, and occasionally read to each other from things we think the other should hear. We have met each other's children, which was its own category of experience. Rosa liked him immediately and was only slightly smug about it. Miguel was more reserved and warmer than I expected once he warmed up. David's daughter in Seattle liked me in the practical, appraising way of a woman who has been watching out for her father and wanted to see who had shown up. His son in Chicago called me a good influence on my dad, the first time we met, which David found mortifying and which I found accurate and endearing. We have disagreed, because of course we have, and the disagreements have been about the things people disagree about when they are building something new at 64 and 67. How much time to spend together, how much independence to preserve, what a shared life means when both people have full lives of their own that they are not interested in dismantling. We have navigated these disagreements with the specific patience of people who have both been through enough to know that a disagreement is not a crisis, and that most things can be talked through if you are willing to say the thing you actually mean rather than the thing you think you are supposed to say. I retired last June, 2 years ahead of my original plan, because the school district went through a difficult restructuring, and the offer was good, and I was ready in a way I had not been the year before. David and I spent 2 weeks in Portugal in July, which was a trip I had been wanting to take for years, and which was everything I had wanted it to be. We walked through Lisbon for days, and ate at restaurants we found by wandering and sat in the evenings at outdoor tables with wine, and the particular light of a place that has been beautiful for centuries and knows it. He took photographs constantly, which I found charming, and I wrote in my journal every morning, which he found charming, and we were, in the simple and difficult and irreducible meaning of the word, happy. I think about the message I almost did not send. The one in March 2 years ago, sent at 8:30 in the evening after I had read his profile paragraph 3 times and decided, against the 4 years of fatigue that were pulling me toward giving up, to say exactly what I thought. I think about Carmen's question, what would you do instead? I think about David's daughter telling him he was not a person who was supposed to stop trying. I think about my grandmother's garden in Tucson and the feeling of lying in it in the summer, the dry heat and the creosote smell after rain, the feeling that was something between safety and possibility. I tried to describe that feeling to David on the 3rd night we talked, and he said it was the most precise description of a childhood feeling he had ever read, and I said I had been trying to find the words for it for 60 years. I am still finding words. I think that is the point. Not that you find them all and are finished, but that you keep looking, and that the looking is better when there is someone beside you who is also looking and who tells you when you have gotten close. My name is Sylvia Jean Moreno. I am 66 years old. I am a retired 5th grade teacher in Tempe, Arizona, with a garden that has learned to grow and a mole recipe from my grandmother and a shelf of books, and a man named David who reads what I write and responds to what I actually say. I was on a dating app for 4 years and had 17 first dates and 0 second ones that went anywhere real. And then I had one conversation at 11 o'clock at night that lasted 3 hours and 3 minutes and changed the answer to the question of what comes next. I almost did not send the message. I sent it anyway. That is the whole story. That is everything.